Okay, excellent. So, what we're going to focus on today is the lesson planning section of the oral exam, the lezione simulata. Okay, if you have to leave early, please don't worry because we'll upload this video to the YouTube channel early next week. And what my focus is for this session is trying to answer your questions, because I've got quite a lot of questions, obviously, as the exam have been underway in a number of places in Italy. So we will start from some of the questions that I've already received. And that I've already kind of prepared my answer to. And then I will also, of course, answer any other questions that you have in the time allowed, of course. If you have a question, especially if it's related to what I'm talking about, please pop it in the chat. I will monitor the chat, and if I see things that are relevant to the topic I'm discussing, I'll answer it live. Okay. But do feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat. Okay. So we're going to start with the first question. This is a question I got a few days ago already. I'm sorry, I'm drinking something hot to try to soothe my whole respiratory system. We're seeing a few grammar topics in the tracce. What is the best way to approach them? So this happened a few days ago, and we've seen things like the present perfect, or the present perfect and the past simple, or things more to do with lexicogrammar. What is the best way to approach grammar? Now, everything I'm going to say in this webinar, and broadly speaking, everything I say when it comes to the oral exam of the concorso, needs to be seen with a huge caveat in mind, which is that each committee does their own thing. So although there are criteria that are valid on a national level, what I'm saying may be valid. Most of the time it is valid, and it would be regarded as valid by people with kind of a background in Cambridge Delta or international ELT, the way that we conceive of language learning and teaching. However, the oral exam is heavily influenced by the personal, really, preferences of examiners. So I can answer this question, and I can answer all of the questions. I can try to answer all of the questions that you have, but please bear in mind that my answers need to be seen with this limitation. Okay. Stefania is asking if we're talking about the topic for the lesson planning or the question that we get, the domande disciplinari. No, we're talking about lesson planning today. What's the best way to approach grammar? I've talked about this in a recent newsletter. The most straightforward way of approaching a grammar topic is with a PPP or TTT or ESA lesson framework. So kind of presentation, practice, production, in which you present the target language. The target language is, for example, the present perfect, or whatever the topic is. And then you give the student the opportunities to practice it, and then to produce language more freely, for example, with a role play, in which they can use a target language, but also other language. You can use PPP, you can use TTT, which is test, teach, test, which, as the name suggests, first does an activity in which you kind of gauge the level of the students and see if they actually already maybe know the present perfect. Then you do a teaching activity, and then you test how much they've learned again. Or you can do ESA, engage, study, activate, which a lot of committees seem to be seem to like for some reason. And you know, you have it's a kind of a broad way of understanding a lesson plan. So you do an activity to engage the student, like a lead-in activity, for example, to stimulate their interest. Then you get down to some more serious study activities in which you can do some practice, you can do some drilling, you can do a reading, you know, you can do a number of different things to really study the topic, not just a grammar topic, it applies to most topics that you can get at the exam. And then activate. So you do an activity that's a little bit freer, a little bit more creative sometimes, to use that language that they've learned. And activate really the knowledge and the skills that they've gained. These are the most straightforward ways of approaching a grammar topic because it allows you to predetermine what target language will be tackled in the lesson. If you do a task-based learning lesson, for example, you cannot as easily predetermine that the students will use the present perfect. You can hypothesize that they might, but they won't necessarily do that. Okay. What's important to note, I think, is also that if a committee is giving you a grammar topic, then in my book, they probably will accept that you can predetermine the language, the target language that you're teaching. A lot of people would disagree with this. A lot of people would say that there is no point in predetermining, okay, today I'm going to teach the present perfect, because students aren't going to learn that. They're not going to learn what you teach them, whatever grammar you teach them, but it has to come from them. But I think if the committee is giving you these topics, then it is possible that they will be receptive to these kinds of lesson plans, of these lesson structures, really. Because otherwise, why would they give you a grammar topic? You know what I'm saying? I'm having a look at the questions. Yes, so Julia is asking, can't we introduce communicative functions or vocabulary while talking about grammar topics? I would have to see the specific lesson plan to make to give you a better informed answer. But I think as long as you are mainly addressing the traccia that you've been given, so the grammar topic that you've been given in this case, yes, of course, you can introduce other stuff. But I think, once again, you want to achieve what you're setting out to do, what they're telling you to do. So keep the focus on that grammar. Anything else can be incidental, can be, you know, can contribute to learning that grammar. And of course, you know, you will have things like listening activities, reading activities, speaking activities, things that are not, you know, studying the grammar or drilling the grammar necessarily, but will contribute to learning that grammar. So it doesn't have to be a bunch of, you know, multiple choice, gap fills, whatever, all to do with grammar. You can bring in other things, of course, to make the lesson more well-rounded and more communicative. So yes, absolutely, but don't lose sight of the goal, which is to cover the topic that you were given. Serena is asking me, can we use gamification in the activate part? That's the way that question is phrased. Gamification, I would think of it more as a philosophy almost, more like a method. I hesitate to use the word method, but think of it more as an underlying philosophy to everything that you do, kind of using games and, you know, rewards and bonuses and everything that's typical of games and video games in everything you do. That's gamification. You can use games in the activate part. Yes, why not? Or in the engage part, typically we sometimes use games to stimulate the the learners at the start of the lesson, and that can be something as simple as turning whatever your activity you're doing in groups into a game. Even something as simple as you know, find all of the instances of the present perfect in this text, for example. You do it in groups, and then the group that finishes first wins. That's kind of applying that idea of game to something. People disagree whether this is a strategy that works, but if you can justify it and if you've done it yourself, perhaps, then by all means. Okay, another question. How can I create assessment rubrics for my lesson? I know that a lot of you are worried about sort of assessment and assessment rubrics. And I get it. It's a difficult thing to do. Your starting point for creating assessment rubrics, which are the griglie di valutazione in Italian, your starting point will be your lesson aims. So what did you set out to achieve in this lesson? By the end of the lesson, what should your students learn and be able to do? And how are you going to assess that? Okay. There are different ways to create an assessment rubric, but the key components of an assessment rubrics are the criteria, the levels, and the descriptors. The descriptors are at the intersection of levels and criteria. So let's say that we've taught a lesson about the present perfect, and our aim was for the students to describe the timeline of their lives, let's say, using the present perfect and the past simple correctly. So what we're going to be assessing here, this is a very simplified example. Of course, your lesson is going to be more complex than this, but one of the criteria will be accuracy, speaking accuracy. You may have a criteria for grammar accuracy, for example. And so these are your criteria. Then you have the levels. Okay, so these could be numbers, they could be descriptors, they could be descriptive labels is what I mean, which is what they're trying now to remove, if I'm not incorrect, in primary school. So in via di primaria acquisizione, that's a descriptive label. You can have a descriptive label and corresponding numerical grade. So for example, kind of like excellent, for example, let's say that you have an excellent or outstanding descriptive label, and then it corresponds to 8, 9, and 10, let's say, for example. So you have your levels, you have your criteria, and then you have to describe what that criteria looks like at different levels. Okay. These should be clear, understandable. So remember that to write them in a way that your students will understand them. Another thing you can do, especially if it's summative assessment, is mention to the committee that you also have Italian versions of the summative assessment grids, because summative assessment, it has multiple stakeholders, including parents, who may want to understand why their child failed an assignment, for example. And that's essentially how you create assessment rubrics. The descriptors are phrased well, I think, at their best when they're in the form of short sentences or can-do statements. So the student can do this with these limitations, for example. Getting a question. In the Concorso 2022, the committee claimed that I had to follow the assessment rubrics of the Programmazione Iniziale. Do you agree with that? Stefania, what do you mean by that? What did they say specifically? Programmazione Iniziale of whom? Give us a bit of context for that, and I'll try to answer your question. I very rarely agree with what the examiners say, but that's a me problem, not a you problem. Which lesson formats do you recommend? That's also a difficult question to answer because unfortunately a lot of this depends on your committee. So as usual, the advice is, to find out as much as you can about the lesson formats that seem to be working for your committee. But also a lesson format that you find useful, that you feel comfortable with. Identify this before the exam, I think. And even if it's not particularly innovative or, the shiny new thing, I would much rather have you work with something that you're comfortable presenting and defending than something that you're not very familiar with, just because you think it's more innovative. Also, don't expect the committees to necessarily want shiny new things, because a lot of the time they can be a bit traditional as well. Like I said, different examiners in the same committee may have different opinions. By their very nature, unfortunately, these questions are difficult to answer. But don't take it for granted that you necessarily have to do something super shiny that nobody's ever done before. Okay. Okay. Can we use textbooks or only authentic materials? I've seen both, to be honest. I don't see why you wouldn't be able to use textbooks. Perhaps don't just use the textbook. That's something that probably doesn't give a lot of variety to your lesson plan, like only using textbooks, and then your lesson plan becomes just literally screenshot after screenshot of a textbook. That can look a little bit boring, perhaps. I don't think there is an inherent problem in using textbooks. Do cite the source, the author, and all of that. But I don't think there's an inherent problem in using textbooks. Obviously cite them, but also cite the authentic materials. How much information do we need to include? Sorry, I'm drinking left and right. Just to continue, just to carry on. Some tracce are allowing only 15 minutes for the presentation. So what should we focus on? So as opposed to the last concorso, which was 45 minutes, but there were no domande disciplinari. There were some follow-up questions, which were sometimes about laws, sometimes in Italian even. They were about parte A of the program. So presentations could sometimes go a bit longer. This time, by law, so because of the bando, it is technically no longer than 22.5 minutes for the scuola secondaria. In Lombardy, for example, the tracce are allowing only 15 minutes. So it says explicitly 15 minutes. So what should you focus on? I think if they're giving you just 15 minutes, they want you to go to the core of the thing. So focusing in the presentation on what you'll be doing. So what are the stages of the lesson? What are the activities in the lesson? And assessment. The assessment is also a big thing. That's what I would do if I had 15 minutes. Does that mean that you don't have to put in all the other details? Not necessarily, because don't forget that it's kind of an official document, isn't it? Your presentation. So I would still plan for a full, formal document in which you talk about the students, the class, the context, the lesson aims, all of that. I would still put it in, but then when it comes to presenting it orally, I'd probably focus more on the actual activities in your lesson. Okay. Let me have a look at the questions. Okay, so Stefania is saying, usually we do the programmazione iniziale. At the end of it, there are assessment rubrics, and the committee said that we have to follow these rubrics anytime we assess students. No, obviously I disagree with that. But what I disagree with or not, it unfortunately doesn't count. I feel very sad when I have to say these things. No, it makes no sense, of course, because when you have, like, how are you going to use the same assessment rubrics for a whole year? That makes no sense to me. I'm sorry, but no, that makes no sense to me. But your aim is to pass the exam. So if you hear that this is a criticism that has been that has occurred, in exams in your committee, then do that. What can I say? No, I disagree, but I'm not your examiner. Okay. Yeah, Chiara is saying in the last concurso, they asked me to start directly with the procedures. Yes, this happened. Or people started talking about, the context and all of that, and they asked them to skip to the procedures. So they were interrupted and asked to skip to the procedures. So that goes to show that that's the key thing that they're interested in. I still would caution you against only putting that in your presentation, because if they have a look at your, like, you leave the file with them, whatever, and they want to have a look later, you never know how these things can go. So I would still put in all the other information. Can I only do the formative assessment without doing the summative assessment? And the same question is from Liliana. Is summative assessment to be included together with a final test, or can we just do formative assessment? I don't know if you're going to like my answer. So in real life, it would make no sense to necessarily do summative assessment after 2 or 3 hours worth of lesson. Yeah, I don't imagine that most of you would do this in real life. You might sometimes, but most of the time you will not. So it's a bit of a forced, shoehorned, far-fetched exercise here that you're doing. Whether it has to be summative in nature or formative is going to be, again, mostly up to the preferences of your committee. But in in past years, they have asked for this. So there does seem to be, if not a consensus 100% across the board, there does seem to be a trend that they want assessment grids, griglie di valutazione. So I would always try to put them in. does it have to be summative? I get this question so often. It's probably safe to put it in. I disagree with it from a pedagogical perspective. I'm sure most of you would disagree with it from a pedagogical perspective, but if this is what the committee wants, this is what the committee will get. Do stress that even summative assessment can have a formative role for your students, because this is, it's remarked in the Indicazioni Nazionali, the role of formative assessment, Indicazioni Nazionali, in the relevant laws that deal with evaluation and assessment. So you can explain that as well. Any other? Angela is asking, I went through different lesson plans and I saw very few including summative assessment. Is it because it's unusual to evaluate students after a lesson or 2 lessons about just one topic? Yeah, like in real life, I don't think a lot of us would give students a grade after just 1 or 2 lessons, because summative assessment is about giving a grade that the parents can see. That's how high stakes this is. But I feel like perhaps some committees want you to show that if you had to do summative assessment, you could do it. It's kind of you're displaying your capabilities for them to see. Whether or not you would do this in an actual class, then. Okay, moving on to other questions. I'm trying to strike a balance between the questions that I got beforehand, which I feel it's only fair that I address here because they took the time to send them to me, and the questions that I'm getting live. A lot of the tracce from Lombardy mentioned the ESCS index. What is this and how does it influence our lesson plan? I've gotten a few questions about this and I've merged them kind of into this question. What is it? The Economic, Social and Cultural Status Index is a PISA index that measures the economic, social and cultural status of pupils, of school students. Okay, so it's you can think of it as their background, their socioeconomic and cultural background, which of course can bring us back also to that idea of svantaggio that we have in the Direttiva BES. And in some tracce, we have seen things like, in Lombardy, things like, this is the topic of the lesson, teach it to this particular class with 1 student or 2 students with DSA, with specific learning differences, and medium high ESCS index level, or low blah 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 index. What does this mean? So how do we factor that into our decisions for our lesson plan? How do we make it clear that we have considered this when drafting our lesson plan and when ideally we would teach our lesson plan? Some of the possible impacts of socioeconomic and cultural status include the following. The following list comes from obviously what PISA says, some research also, and yeah, from what the PISA analyses say, and some research as well. I am sometimes a bit skeptical about this because I feel like SEC, socioeconomic context, or ESCS, the way that PISA calls it, it can be an unfair variable to look at when we look at academic achievement, but it can stigmatize some kids. So I don't necessarily agree with all of this. However, if they've put it in the tracce, it's because I feel like they want you to think about it. Possible impacts of this variable. First of all, access to technology. So if you've got a low index, you may have kids that don't have as much access to technology. So are you going to be doing the BYOD policy, the bring your own device policy? And if so, is it phones? Most people have phones these days, but is it laptops? Because not all kids have access to their own laptop, and so on and so forth. Availability of study space at home and free time. Do all kids have a space where they can study at home? Do they have the free time to study at home? Some kids have to work. Or some kids have to take care of parents. Some kids are caretakers as well. They may have disabled parents. They may have parents that require their help in different ways. So these are things you may want to consider when it comes to things like using the flipped classroom, how much homework you give, and how crucial that homework is to the development of your following lesson. When you give homework, do you also have a stage in the following lesson in which you allow people to catch up, in which you allow students to catch up if they haven't done the homework? Is that homework assessed? Is that homework assessed summatively? You know, all of these questions I think you need to bear in mind if they've told you that the economic, social, cultural status is low. Kids may have different levels of parent support and parents' availability to come and talk to you if there are issues, for example, with their behavior. They may have the parents' support to do their homework. You know, this can create inequality between your students. On a very extreme, but sadly sometimes true level, you might want to consider the impact of malnutrition and sleep deprivation on your students' emotional well-being and cognitive performance. Obviously, like I say, extreme situations, but still things to be aware of. When they say that the index is low in the area in which you're working, you've got to be thinking about the resources of the schools, because statistically, schools located in areas with a low ESCS index have fewer resources. So when you plan your lesson, are you relying 100% on, for example, an interactive whiteboard? Is there going to be a language lab? Is there going to be a school subscription to software, to magazines, to streaming services? You may want to think about these things when you plan your lesson, and kind of allow for the possibility that these things may not be there, or that if they're not there, or if they falter, like if they break, or if they're not 100% reliable, you'll have another option. You'll have a hard copy, for example, of a text or a quiz that you were going to show on the interactive whiteboard. Students may have fewer opportunities for traveling, for cultural exchange. So obviously something to keep in mind when it comes to language learning, particularly. Financial constraints of your to your students, to what your students can do. So which tools are you going to use? I know that some people give homework that, for example, is to do with watching an episode on Netflix, where you can't necessarily know that the kids are going to have access to Netflix, for example. There's also some research that suggests that kids from kind of disadvantaged, I don't like the terminology, but disadvantaged family backgrounds have lower motivation for learning, which is something you may want to obviously factor in when you're when you're drafting your lesson plan? Are you going to need to show your learners the relevance of what they're doing for their future? Are you going to be actively fostering a sense of motivation in your students? Are you going to take their interests into consideration when designing your activities, because this can foster motivation? Higher dropout rate. This is another big topic. Just something that you may want to keep in mind, depending on the context that you'll be working with. But there is also some research, and PISA, I think, mentioned it as well, that kids from these kind of environments tend to have a higher dropout rate. Also, some research suggests that a low ESCS correlates with higher chances of learning behavior issues and with lower, that should say lower reading abilities. And also, you always have to consider the intersection of coming from this kind of background and other issues. So, coming from this background may exacerbate other factors such as disabilities or behavioral issues, anxiety, specific learning difficulties. So how do they interact? What is the interplay between these factors? And how does that influence your lesson plan? How does that influence the inclusion measures that you implement in your lesson plan? Which is another big topic, as you know. Okay. And speaking of inclusion, a lot of the tracce from Lombardy mention alunno disabile con percorso personalizzato e prove equivalenti. What does this mean, and which disabilities should we include in the lesson plan, in your opinion? First of all, a bit of a reference here that I've prepared for you. This is quite a recent document which reminds us that students with disabilities can follow one of 3 paths, so percorsi didattici ordinari, personalizzati, and differenziati. This is, by the way, for secondaria di secondo grado. And why is that? Because if they follow, if they have options A and B, they can still get their diploma, il titolo di studio valevole, convalenza, okay? So il titolo di studio. If they do option C, the third option, percorso differenziato, then they don't get necessarily their diploma, but just the attestato of the credits that they've taken. And this is at secondaria di secondo grado. Secondaria di primo grado, this doesn't happen. So the options are A and B. I've lost my pen, look at that. Essentially, this is what it means, that you can have either a student with disability that does the same thing as everyone else, that's option B, and that has the same assessment as everyone else. Or you could have a student with a disability, in which you have personalization measures, which also apply to the assessment. And as you can see, there's 2 options, verifiche identiche, verifiche equivalenti. So this can be true for English, and maybe it's different from another subject, but you have to, to look at how this applies to your lesson. So the student in the tracce has percorso personalizzato e prove equivalenti. Okay, so it's B with the option of prove equivalenti. And what does this mean? This simply means that the assessment will be a little bit different, but not so different that you aren't able to tell that they've achieved the same objectives broadly as the rest of the class. Okay. You do this in different ways. How do you teach when you have students with disabilities, but also with other special educational needs. You may use, and this is from the same document that I was talking about, redundant, so using different communication channels to convey the same content, for example, the auditory and visual channels simultaneously or in the same lesson. You will use facilitation, for example, before you do a reading activity, you do a pre-reading activity. Bearing in mind that a lot of these measures, and this is what the document says, and broadly speaking, what we know about inclusion, a lot of these things apply and can be useful, not just for students with a PAY or a PDP, but more broadly for other students as well, and for all the students potentially even. The use of online dictionaries, the use of glossaries, the presence of an expert support. You might have someone like a cultural mediator, or I read recently about a drama specialist to kind of implement dramatization techniques. You may want to favor group work. You may want to give less homework to specific students or allow specific students to do the homework using a different channel. You know, again, be creative. When it comes to assessment, what's assessment that's equivalente? It's a tricky one because they still have to show you that they've learned. So you're not exonerating them completely from being assessed, but you do it a little bit differently. You might give them a bit of extra time. You might give them fewer tests. You might change the assessment type, depending on what disability or special educational need you are dealing with. Different assessment types may be more appropriate. You might simplify, grade the language in the assessment. You might use observation as one of a number of assessment tools. So kind of use a variety of assessment tools. Okay. As for the question, which disability should we talk about? Talk about a disability that potentially you've worked with, that you are comfortable with, that you have researched, perhaps. Something that you have some level of experience with would be ideal, I think. If they don't tell you which one, choose something that you are comfortable with. And that's, I think, fairly intuitive on a broad level. Another very specific question from someone who did the concurso last year. My last concurso, the committee asked me about mistakes that teachers can make. Can you talk about it, please? Can I? Yes, I can, because I've made so many myself. I've written an article about this, actually, about all the mistakes that we make. But as usual, I think that you need to have a framework in mind, I think, to kind of draw on and have an organized way of, as organized as possible way of thinking. Okay, so what do teachers have to do? What are the competencies of a language teacher? And then how can those fail? And one way of looking at this, there are many ways of looking at this. I could tell you dozens of mistakes, that we can make, from talking too much, to disregarding specific students, to taking a yes as a sign of understanding, to asking the question, do you understand, or is everything clear, where the answer is obviously going to be yes, to kind of rushing through activities, over planning, under planning. I've seen all sorts of things, so I could talk about random or different mistakes that teachers can make, and that I've obviously personally made as well as a teacher. But I think a nice way of thinking about this is, again, from that document, that I showed you before. There's a lot of content in there that's really good. These are some questions that you might want to ask yourself. And this is going to go in the recording, so you can, watch it and kind of ask yourself these questions. And they're about inclusion. But again, I feel that thinking about inclusion makes us better as teachers in general, and not just for students who may have a pay or a PDP. Things to do with considering all the learners' needs, encouraging participation, involving and engaging learners actively, encouraging students to support each other, supporting students when they're having difficulties, fostering a sense of respect, implementing rules, kind of preventing bullying, so how also big one, how we approach assessment. I feel like this is also a big one. Not writing clear criteria for students, not making sure that students know what they're being assessed on, not having enough self-assessment for students, so students don't have a sense of how they're progressing. Not even, yeah, I've heard this one as well. I don't know why, but not allowing students to review their work after they got a mark. I've not done this personally, but I've seen it. That doesn't help student. That's a mistake in my book, because if the student cannot see their test and what they got wrong, how they're going to improve. So these are some questions that you might want to consider as well when it comes to reflecting on the mistakes that we make as teachers, and try to answer a question like that. And finally, is this over? Yes, that's over. Okay, that's the last question that I got. And then we have a few minutes for further questions. I struggle with designing suitable activities when it comes to presenting an author and their 1-2 novels. For example, with tracce like Daniel Defoe. Sorry. How can I present his biography plus imagery plus Robinson Crusoe plus Mole Sanders, okay, in maximum 2 lessons? To this, I say, first of all, it doesn't have to be 2 lessons unless it's specified. A lot of people I've seen have done 3 lessons. To be honest, in past years, they even did 4 lessons. I don't think that's doable now with the time limits being as they are. But I've seen people do more lessons. And the second thing is, when it comes, if you're given a traccia where there's a lot of content, so they're asking you to present an author, and they're kind of, imagery in this case, but it could be any and all, characteristics or aspects. So the biography, their let's say imagery, and on top of that 2 novels, that's a lot. Okay, that's a lot. So my suggestion in this case is, if they don't give you all this work, don't put it in by yourselves. Don't be overly what's the word? Ambitious. Don't be overly ambitious. Be a bit ambitious, because I have heard that they want you to present quite a bit of content. However, don't be overly ambitious, because nobody could reasonably do this in 2 lessons. All right. Second thing is, if you're giving a lot of this, do kind of rely on homework and a bit of extensive reading as well. So it doesn't all have to be done in class, because nobody could do this in 2 hours, could you? Or reflect on your lesson aims, because they have to be realistic. You have 2 hours. Let's say that you have 2 hours and you have to touch on these 4 things. biography, imagery, and 2 specific works, you're going to want to give an overview of things. You cannot possibly go into details. So you'll do 1 or 2 activities per aspect that you have to cover. Does that make sense? And that this needs to be reflected, of course, in the lesson aims and in the assessment. You will not be able to do everything, okay? Not everything, like you will not be able to do everything in depth anyway. They will not know the Vita Morte Miracoli of all of this by the end of your lessons. But having focus and smart lesson aims will allow you to proceed with more confidence, I think. Okay, so you'll do, for example, a video on the biography of the author, whoever they are, and then present some of the work, and then based on that kind of presentation of some of the work that you do, then they work, in this case, on the imagery. Don't be afraid to work with extracts, because they're not going to be able to read 2 full books, are they, in 2 lessons? There is no way. And this isn't what we do in class anyways. Okay, don't be afraid to work with extracts. Don't be afraid to work with alternative sources as well. So you have a literature lesson doesn't mean it's 2 hours of reading. You can use videos. You can use all sorts of activities, really. Okay, you can use websites. There's can't remember off the top of my head what the name is, but there are plenty of websites where you can find short bios of authors. Which can easily be put into a quiz, for example. Add that game-like quality to it. I can't go obviously into how you do a full literature lesson, because there's a whole course about this, but don't be, the bottom line is, don't be overly ambitious with it, you know, and have specific lesson aims that are smart and, you know, that are achievable. Okay. Antonia is suggesting Spark Notes. Yes, Spark Notes is definitely one of the sources that I would recommend using. Absolutely. And she's saying, I recently used Ed Puzzle to present the biography of Shakespeare. Yeah, there's also a lot of there's a whole website with lesson plans on Shakespeare, whose name obviously I cannot remember now. That's very sad. But yeah, don't be afraid to use that material as well. Would you recommend the lesson be minimum 2 hours? Yeah, I think so. For some unknown reason, this is what they have seemed to favored. They seem to have favored this in recent years. It makes things more tricky, of course, because now you have less time to present it. But yeah, I would say probably 2 hours, which means also that you should probably start pre-preparing your presentation before, because it will take you longer to plan for 2 hours or 3 than it would to plan for 1. Okay, let me scroll back and see about some other questions. Okay. Where do we find the codes for disabilities in the ICF document? In which section specifically? I don't know that you have to add this to the lesson plan. I don't remember off the top of my head. I'm sorry, Serena. I'm happy to look it up for you. But I don't know if you have. You could actually put it in. Yeah, you could put it in. I think the key thing is, of course, that you cite the right laws. That's the kind of the given. It's a bit of a given that you have to do this. I'm happy to look it up for you because I can't remember exactly the the page number, the section, but do get in touch and I can do this for you. Let's have a look. Things that don't make sense. Yeah. I also find jigsaw activities very useful to prepare literature classes. Yeah, and jigsaw activities, to be honest, jigsaw reading, you can do jigsaw reading or jigsaw listening. And I think this could also be a good idea for presenting the biography of an author as well, like kind of dividing their lives into stages and giving different stages to different groups, and then the experts kind of regroup in the new groups and they kind of build the life of the author. Relatedly, another simple idea, because here sometimes, you know, we want to do simple rather than super complicated and then we can't explain it, is jumbled text. So you have a text, why not, with a biography of an author, you cut it, if you print it, you cut it into bits, strips of paper, and you scramble them and you give them to groups and then they have to put them in order. Or you can do this obviously digitally, but sometimes I just like to stick to pen and paper. I've always done it pen and paper really because I find it more, I don't know, they're doing something with their hands. And that's another way of presenting a bio. Another way is having a timeline or having the students design a timeline with Canva, for example. That's another nice one. Okay. Okay, guys, unfortunately, our time together is up today. So I hope that I've answered as many of your questions as possible. Thank you so much for listening. And I will stop sharing my screen now. If you need anything else, you know where to find me. Thank you so much for being with me today. And I wish you all the best for your exam. Let me know how it goes. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. This video will go on YouTube, so you can watch it again there. All right. Thank you. Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.